Jacob sends his sons for food. Back in Canaan, Joseph's father, Jacob, was deeply troubled by the severe conditions. There was hardly any grass for his animals, and the continued dry weather threatened their survival. Soon, there would be no grain or meat to eat. Jacob heard that Egypt had grain for sale, so he sent 10 of his sons to buy some. Remembering how he lost young Joseph years before by sending him on a trip, Jacob kept Benjamin, his youngest son, with him. Genesis 42, 1-4. The 10 brothers took camels and donkeys to carry back the loads of grain they hoped to purchase and traveled down to Egypt. Upon arriving in Egypt, they discovered they needed to present their request for grain to the governor, who was second in power only to Pharaoh. They had no idea that this governor was their brother Joseph, whom they had sold into slavery many years earlier. Joseph recognized his brothers as soon as they appeared before him. When they bowed, he remembered his childhood dream of his brothers bowing to him. And now that prophetic dream had come true. Genesis 42:6. Despite his strong desire to reveal himself and welcome them, Joseph decided to speak harshly to them for their own good. "You say you have come from Canaan to buy food. Why should I believe you?" Joseph asked sternly. "I think you are spies. You probably believe that Egypt is weakening due to the famine and have come to assess our military strength." "We are not spies, my lord," they quickly replied. "We are the sons of an elderly man who needs food. Our father had 12 sons. The youngest is with him, and one is dead." Genesis 42:9-13. Joseph longed to ask about Benjamin, but remained stern. "It might be wise to keep 9 of you in prison and send one of you to bring back the brother and father you claim to have." He continued, "Then I might be convinced you aren't spies." The 10 brothers stood uncomfortably before Joseph as he frowned at them. "On second thought," Joseph added, "I believe it would be better to put all of you in prison to give you a chance to think matters over and decide to tell the truth." "But we're telling the truth," they called out, as guards led them away. Genesis 42:17. This harsh treatment was part of Joseph's plan to test his brothers and see if they had changed since the day they sold him into slavery. 3 days later. After 3 days, Joseph summoned his brothers again. They continued to insist that they had come only to buy needed grain. "You will get your grain," Joseph said, surprising them. "However, one of you will stay here in prison until the young brother you speak of is brought to me." The brothers' faces fell, each fearing he would be the one to be jailed. "This trouble has come upon us because of what we did to Joseph," they murmured fearfully among themselves. "I told you it was wrong to treat him the way you did," Reuben spoke up. "Now we may pay for it." Joseph, speaking in Egyptian, used an interpreter to communicate with his brothers, who spoke only Hebrew, Genesis 42:23. But Joseph still understood Hebrew and comprehended every word they said. Hearing their remorse, he felt so sorry for them that he turned his head away and wept despite their past cruelty. "The guards will take one of you back to prison." "Take one of you back to prison," Joseph said, regaining his composure. The brothers were filled with fear. Joseph's eyes slowly scanned the tense faces before him, finally settling on Simeon, the brother who had suggested killing him years ago. "Take that man to the dungeon," Joseph commanded, pointing to Simeon. Guards swiftly bound the protesting Simeon and dragged him away. The brothers began to realize that God was indeed intervening in their lives. "Leave now," Joseph told the remaining 9. "You will be informed where to pick up your grain and how much to pay." After purchasing the grain and loading it onto their animals, the brothers were relieved to depart. At dusk, they stopped to feed and shelter the animals for the night. When one brother opened his grain sack to feed his animal, he discovered a bag of coins containing the exact amount he had paid for the grain. "It must be the money I paid for my share of the grain," he exclaimed. "How did it get there?" "This is not good," another brother said. "It could be a scheme to arrest you for not paying for the grain." "They could arrest all of us if they accuse one of us of theft," said another. "God is dealing with us because of the wrong things we have done." Genesis 42:25-28. Throughout the rest of the trip, the brothers feared Egyptian soldiers might overtake them, but they safely reached home in Canaan. Jacob was happy to see them return with the grain, but deeply troubled to learn that Simeon was being held prisoner and that the governor of Egypt demanded to see Benjamin. When another brother looked in his travel sack, he also found a bag of coins, the exact amount he had paid for his grain. When Jacob's sons began unloading the grain from their sacks, each was shocked to find a bag of money inside. It was the same amount each had paid the Egyptians. When Jacob learned of this, he feared his sons might be considered thieves and taken back to Egypt. "I have already lost Joseph and Simeon," Jacob said. "Now you say I should send Benjamin to Egypt. I won't do that because I don't trust you to return him to me. Let me take Benjamin, so that we may prove ourselves and rescue Simeon from prison," Reuben suggested. "If I don't return, you may have the lives of my 2 sons." "Don't make foolish promises," Jacob replied. "I don't intend to part with Benjamin. If anything should happen to him, I would die of sorrow." The famine grows worse. As months passed, the famine conditions worsened. Like most others, Jacob didn't realize that there would be 7 years without sufficient rain for crops. Every day he prayed for rain and looked for a change in the weather. However, God had a plan to carry out despite these prayers. The food supply brought from Egypt dwindled so much that Jacob had to instruct his sons to return to Egypt for more grain. Genesis 43:1-2. "There is no use returning for more grain unless we take along Benjamin," Judah respectfully told his father. "We were told by the governor that he wouldn't see us again unless we brought our youngest brother to him." Genesis 43:3. "If you want grain, Benjamin will have to go along. If anything happens to him, I'll be responsible." Genesis 43:8-9. "Then take him," Jacob finally agreed. "Take also some gifts for the Egyptian governor. My servants will prepare packages of honey, spices, ointments, perfumes, and choice dates and nuts. Also, take back the money that was returned to you in your sacks. Offer all these things to the governor. I pray that God will be with you, and that all of you will return safely with Simeon." Dry east winds blowing steadily year after year had turned the once green fields and orchards into vast areas of yellow despair. Once again, Jacob's sons went to Egypt, and once again they stood before the governor, who was their brother. When Joseph saw that they had returned with Benjamin, he was very pleased, but had to hide his feelings. "Take these men to my house and prepare a very special meal for them," he told his chief servant. Genesis 43:16. The servant escorted the 10 brothers to Joseph's quarters. Unsure why they had been brought to such a fine place, they wondered if they were there to receive some sort of punishment. They explained to Joseph's chief servant about their first trip to Egypt for grain and how their money had mysteriously been returned to them. They assured him that they wanted to return the money and had brought more to buy additional grain. Genesis 43:20-22. The servant reassured them, "Don't worry about these things. Make yourselves comfortable until my master comes." While the brothers waited, they were given the chance to bathe, and their animals were fed. Then, to their surprise, their brother Simeon, who had been a prisoner for about a year, was brought to them. Genesis 43:23. At noon, Joseph arrived at his home with some high-ranking Egyptians. The brothers bowed low to the governor and humbly presented the gifts they had brought from Canaan. Joseph thanked them and asked about their father. "Is this the brother you told me about?" Joseph asked, looking at Benjamin. "It is," they replied. "This is Benjamin. He should help prove that we didn't come to Egypt last year as spies." Joseph was so glad to see Benjamin that he almost wept. He had to excuse himself and go to another room, where he broke into tears. He returned shortly. No one could know how he felt standing before 11 brothers who were unaware that he was their sibling. Genesis 43:29-31. Food was brought in for all present. With so many good things to eat and drink before them, the brothers quickly forgot their fears and worries. Benjamin enjoyed the meal more than anyone. He was served far more of everything, including special dishes not given to the others, as Joseph had quietly instructed his servants to give him special treatment. Genesis 43:34. Benjamin didn't try to consume all the food set before him, but it increased his awe for the governor. He would have been even more awed if he had known that the governor was his brother. Brothers prepared to return to Canaan. Early the next morning, Jacob's sons set out for home with as much grain as their animals could carry. They were pleased with how things had turned out, unaware that something unpleasant was about to occur. Toward noon, they noticed a cloud of dust off to the southwest. As the cloud grew larger, they realized a band of men on horses was swiftly approaching. To their surprise, the leader of the group was the chief servant of Egypt's governor. "Why have you treated your host, the governor, so badly?" the chief servant demanded. "What do you mean?" they asked, confused. "The governor's special silver cup is missing," the servant replied. "It's the one he was using yesterday when you ate with him. He thinks one of you stole it." "We aren't thieves," the brothers protested. "We even brought back the money that was returned to us on our first trip to Egypt. Why would we steal now? Search us. If you find the cup in our belongings, we will become your servants. If one of us is hiding the cup, he shall die." Genesis 44:4-9. They felt confident the cup wouldn't be found with them, as none would have dared take such a valuable item from the powerful governor of Egypt. "Let it be as you have said," agreed the chief servant, motioning his men to search the brothers' belongings. To their unpleasant surprise, the money for the grain was again found in the sacks. Worse still, the silver cup was discovered in Benjamin's sack. Genesis 44:12. In miserable silence, the brothers packed their belongings back onto their animals. Surrounded by their pursuers, they returned to face the governor. When Joseph appeared, they fell down before him. "What have you been trying to do?" Joseph asked sternly. "Obviously you don't realize that I have the power to recognize evil intentions." "What can we say?" asked Judah, the brother who had promised his father he would look out for Benjamin. "There's no way of proving we aren't guilty, and we aren't. We've done some wicked things in our time, and if God wants to punish us by making us your slaves, so be it." Genesis 44:16. "It needn't be that way," Joseph said. "I only ask that Benjamin becomes my servant. The rest of you may return to your father." Some of the brothers might have thought this was a fair way to settle matters. Judah did not. He was determined to set Benjamin free. He explained that his father had almost died of sorrow when he lost his young son Joseph, and that he was certain to die of sorrow if Benjamin did not return home. Joseph had treated his brothers harshly to make them aware of their past evil deeds. He had returned their grain money twice to keep them in a sober state of mind. He had his servants place the silver cup in Benjamin's sack to ensure that Benjamin would have to stay with him for a while. Genesis 44:1-2. When Joseph's servants found the missing silver cup in Benjamin's sack, the brothers were filled with dread and sorrow. Jacob's final years in Egypt. Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt, during which his children's families increased greatly in number. Because God had given Jacob the name Israel, his descendants were known as Israelites, a nation that developed within Egypt. As Jacob felt his life drawing to a close, he sent for Joseph and his two young sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob wanted to bless his grandsons and ensure that they would carry on the legacy of their forefather, Israel. Jacob adopts Joseph's children as his own. God told me years ago that I would be the father of a great nation and that my descendants would inherit the land of Canaan, Jacob told Joseph. I want to adopt your sons as mine to ensure they remain part of our family instead of mixing with the Egyptians. Joseph agreed and brought his sons to Jacob, who was weak and partly blind, resting on his bed. Jacob fondly hugged his grandsons, recognizing it as a great blessing from God to live to see them. He sat up to pray for them, placing his left hand on Manasseh's head and his right hand on Ephraim's. Thinking his father was too blind to see which boy was which, Joseph gently moved Jacob's left hand from Manasseh's head. It is customary to place the right hand on the firstborn, Joseph said. Manasseh is the older. I know, my son, Jacob replied. The greatest nation on earth will come from Manasseh, but a commonwealth of nations will come from Ephraim. Jacob then asked God to make mighty nations from each of the boys. Genesis 48:19. Knowing his death was near, he asked to see all his sons. After speaking to his sons, Jacob passed away. Joseph ordered Egyptian physicians to prepare his father's body for burial, using the Egyptian method of embalming, which took many days. This was followed by a long period of mourning by the Egyptians. Finally, Joseph, his brothers, their families, and a large number of Egyptian officials, soldiers, and servants set out for Canaan with Jacob's body. The journey covered 300 miles, making it one of the greatest funeral processions in history. Genesis 57:13. This grand ceremony was not just because of Jacob's high regard among the Egyptians, but also because they considered Joseph a national hero for saving them from starvation. Jacob lived to be 147 years old. Though he might have seemed like a plain, unimportant man, he played a crucial role in God's plan to establish the great nation of Israel.